Luca Bombardieri is associate professor in Aegean and Cypriot archaeology at the University of Siena, and since 2009, he is scientific director of the Erimi Archaeological Project. His research covers a broad range of interests, which includes his most recent published book, From Exploration to Exploitation: Giovanni Mariti, Domenico Sestini, Antonio Mondaini, and the Early History of Cypriot Archaeology. Luca, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Andrea. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm thrilled to have come across this book. Clearly, this is something that like appealed to you. There's got to be some sort of inspiration behind your kind of drive to write a book on the archaeological practices in Cyprus. What was that inspiration?
The primary inspiration is that all the three guys I tried to explore and study in this recently published book from Italy, and specifically they are coming from my home region, Tuscany. And so I felt them like familiar because they lived in Cyprus, they traveled to Cyprus, they lived there, and they were attracted from Cyprus antiquities. So I felt them like, on a strictly personal point of view, I felt them like my grandparents, and so I was inspired by them in trying to get an insight and trying to research as much as I could on the documents they left. And try to outline which was their activity, their ideas, and how they share these ideas and activity with their own public in the 18th century when they lived, and so this is the primary inspiration. Then having a look and reading carefully, having a second look to the letters they write, and they are kept in the archive at the University of Bologna, I learned step by step a lot of new stuff about their activities, and many of these documents, even if they are published in Italian, and also they are published in a difficult Italian. Also for someone who is able to read Italian, the Italian of 18th century is difficult to approach for one who is not a native speaker, and so I felt that it was important to focus on these three guys and travelers and pseudo-archaeologists, as we can define them, and try to collect as much possible, as much information as possible to make it available to the public and of scholars and community of interests for the Cypriot antiquity.
Now, you actually start by talking about a concept called extractivism. Can you explain what this concept is and how it applies to the archaeological practices that were discussed in your book?
Extractivism is an economic model which is common throughout the global South. It's something that is used by economists for describing the way how the Western powers in colonial and decolonial context physically extract natural resources from third world countries or decolonized or colonized countries. And I found that this definition, this model, let's say, beyond the economic application, could be also an appropriate model to outline patterns of archaeological activities in Cyprus, in Cyprus and elsewhere, in contexts where the Western countries, Western European and Western countries in general, conducted archaeological or pseudo-archaeological activities in the 18th and 19th century. And this is the case of Cyprus. Mutatis mutandis, extract natural resources is something that can be parallel to extract antiquities. The feeling is the same. The exploitation of antiquities in this kind of context is mainly driven by ideological and economic interest of Western museum collectors, and then putting on the field like a process of competition among different actors at different levels, thus activating mechanism of accumulation in a chain where there are different actors involved, like local diggers, like collectors, like museums, and all these system, all this mechanism appears to me really similar to the extractivism in the economic model of extracting raw material and resources from the same context sometimes.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept. Most, at least superficially, we don't see antiquities as something to exploit. I mean, you later on through education you realize that that's exactly what antiquities were. They were very much part of this exploitative process, and to view it in those terms, it's very eye-opening. And I mean, Cyprus clearly was a victim. Could we use that term? Was a victim of this extractivism in this period in the 19th and 20th centuries?
Victim is what we feel. Object is what they really. I mean, this kind of process involved people from Cyprus. So how can I say?
There were Greek and Turkish Cypriots involved in the extraction of the antiquities. There were definitely players within Cyprus as much as there were outside of Cyprus.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's a chain where all of us are victims, let's say, in some way. There are not the bad and the good and the ugly, but we are all victims of a system which is, at the end, if you think, Andres, is simply based on the supply and demand balance. So is what we can define a capitalistic mechanism. No, the local diggers supply collectors with antiquities, the collectors supply museum with antiquities. So it's a chain, and all these actors benefits from the extraction and exploitation of antiquities in Cyprus, as well as in many other contexts and countries which are in this concept of wide concept of decolonized areas.
Apart from an economic incentive for Cypriots to participate in the collection of antiquities, did they use at any point antiquities to support respective cultural and political claims?
Sure, it is quite clear, especially reading the documents from the, let's say, from the end of the 18th century and much more evidently in the 19th century, that there was like cultural use of antiquities, which can eventually produce particularly peculiar interest. Like, for example, the Greek communities, the Greek-speaking communities in Cyprus, during the end of 18th to the 19th century, they were particularly focusing on the classical Greek antiquities, and the collection they were collecting, let's say, the set of antiquities they were collecting in Cyprus, they were considered, interpreted like a sort of didactic, pedagogic exposition and exhibitions to build up the Greek identity of this community. And so the attention was through the classical antiquities, directly linking the Cyprus with Greece, with the aim to educate the Cypriot audience. And this is quite evident. For example, the foundation of the Cyprus Museum in the 1882 it's Greek in its architecture, and the marble is imported from Greece for the construction of the entrance pronaos of the Cypriot Museum itself, and it was promoted on a strong initiative of intellectual elite of Greek-speaking Cypriot in this period. And during the same period, while the Greek-speaking Cypriot community was enhancing the Greek roots, the Greek identity of their country, the Turkish Cypriot intellectuals were also confronting a similar need and necessity of constructing the identity of the island, and they were using antiquity, different antiquities as a foundation for justifying political demands and cultural claims, and they chosen, by contrast to the Greek Hellenic classic roots, they use the Lusignan dynasty, the medieval past, as a base for their to construct their own identity. And the Lapidary Museum, which was founded in Nicosia in 1928, is an example of this, because over there it was the medieval Cyprus at the center, at the focus of attention, and they make like a different shifting in the interpretation of these antiquities. For of course, for political claims, for cultural claims, and this is all this evidence is also connected with the exploitation of antiquities and extracting of them.
All right, so let's start with Giovanni Mariti.
Yeah.
Who was he exactly, and what brought him to Cyprus?
Oh, a mysterious man. Let's say Giovanni Mariti is a son of his times, by definition. He, as I told you, he came from Florence and traveled to Cyprus, and he arrived to Cyprus in 1760, like a commercial agent for an English company, trade company. But when we settled in Cyprus, he moved to Larnaca, which was the city of diplomacy, the city where all the houses of representatives from different European countries and diplomats were settling. And then, like it was common during that time, he became from a commercial agent, he became a diplomat, a consular for the Grand Duke of Tuscany, which was finding a representative there. And how can I say, he became a member, an active member of this community of intellectuals, diplomats from Western Europe that were living there. Most of them with this mix-up of consular, diplomatic, and commercial tasks. And one of the first friend he made there was the British consul, Timothy Turner. He was a really powerful man there. And through him, he grew his importance and he became really, as I told you, really an active man of this European community, Western European community in Larnaca.
If I remember right, you mentioned that his observations differ from other travelers to Cyprus at the time. In what way do they differ? In what way is he a little bit more, I think, nuanced and not as biased?
That's something that probably is related to his origin and the place where he grew up. And try to explain. The majority of travelers traveling to the Eastern Mediterranean and the Levant during this period are pilgrims or pilgrims travelers. And it's curious, but the majority of them, while they reached the Holy Land, they described the architecture, the landscape, the folklore, all the aspects they are describing there, just putting in the shadow everything that it was Islamic, Muslim architecture, Islamic architecture, Islamic customs, they are not described. And this is quite curious, and arrive to some top of absurdus, because there are some of them that they were able to describe Jerusalem without mentioning at all the mosques on the explanade of mosque in Jerusalem. So it seems incredible to us, but it was the standard for them. And Mariti, differently, he has a different view, a glimpse which is not religious at all, not affected with religious beliefs and preconcepts. And so he was the first, for example, when he reached the Holy Land and Jerusalem, he is the first that described the big mosque in Jerusalem. And since he was not able to enter because it was not Muslim, he described the internal space of the mosque using the words of a friend of him who was Muslim and could enter there. So you understand, it's a completely different glimpse. And when he reached Cyprus, probably he has also a different approach to what was emerging in that period. Because when he settled in Larnaca and began to stay with the diplomats like Timothy Turner and many others, Larnaca was in an expanding phase, and they were building up new quarters, new districts of the town, and constructing was also like excavating, and excavating was also finding out what was beneath the Larnaca of that period, which was Kition, the ancient city, which is till now evidently beneath the modern Larnaca. And so they're building up, they find out antiquities, like building materials for the new constructions, and everyone was able to see them, and everyone was able to trace back that it was something beneath the modern town. But Mariti was one of the first who noticed and was attracted by this, and kept describing what he was looking at. And this is the second big, let's say, issue we can recognize to Mariti. The antiquities became the object of a direct observation. Archaeological objects become like tools to describe the antiquity. In parallel with the ancient writers' written sources, archaeological tools, archaeological objects became new sources of information in the eyes of Mariti, and his books and his description narrative is full of direct observation. With date, I saw during that day I was with Timothy Turner, and I found out, I saw people that were excavating a marble head of an emperor, and so I'm going to describe, and so on and so on. So, you know, he described and used this evidence, the archaeological evidence, to reconstruct the ancient history of the place where he was living. And that's why he is the first that made a complete map of the ancient Kition, and with all the evidence put on a map, like a sort of how can I say, like now we used to do this archaeological mapping of different regions or different areas. He did it by himself without knowing that it was an archaeological map, of course, but he did it because he was interested in this kind of evidence.
So is Mariti, would we say he's the first archaeologist in Cyprus, like as far as modern archaeology goes?
In the first archaeology, the first who use the archaeological evidence objects to reconstruct ancient history. Of course, he has no specific archaeological methods or methodologies. He just look at what
Yeah.
was going up from the earth, what extracted, to use the same verb we used before, extracted from the earth by people who were excavating there to find out building material. But what is interesting is that he used this observation for an archaeological and an historical reconstruction. And for example, just to give you an example, at one time he describes an event, a specific event, while a friend of him in Larnaca was excavating his cellar beneath his house. And while excavating in the ground, he found out a chamber tomb. And he was afraid, terribly afraid, that the Ottoman authorities would eventually accuse him to have disturbed a grave of a Muslim dead. And so this friend of Mariti called Mariti, and Mariti went there and make like a sort of proto-archaeological expertise, demonstrating to the Ottoman authorities that the tomb was not of a Muslim deposition, but it was of a previous one because of the direction of the chamber tomb, because the objects appear very, very ancient, and so the description he made was used in that case for something that eventually rescue the friend of him, but also he produced a sort of archaeological account in some way. So we can say that he was the first one who expressed clearly an interest for the archaeological evidence, and most of all, the first who used the archaeological evidence in reconstruction the historic and history.
Yeah. Now, Mariti is also known for the first documented acquisition of Cypriot antiquities in Italy. Do you know what that was, and is it still available to be viewed?
Yeah, that's another adventure of my recent life, let's say, because we describe Mariti as the first who positively used the archaeological objects as source to reconstruct the ancient history, and this is the positive side. There's also a dark side, of course, that goes together, and that's exciting because in this turning point we have the emergence of archaeological interest and the emergence of archaeological exploitation from the Western people, like Mariti. And because during one of his promenade with Consul Turner in 1976, Mariti was in Larnaca and saw that from one of the quarrying of building material came out some ancient coins. And it's clearly described by Mariti that the coins arrived to Mr. Turner, to the British consul. The British consul showed to Mariti the coins, and they saw that over the coin it was written Koinon Cyprion, and the face in profile of a Roman emperor, that it was a Severian emperor. And then these coins were partially taken by Turner and partially given to Mariti. And Mariti took this collection of coins and brought back to Italy when he came back there, and decided to distribute these coins, these Roman coins, to France, but also to the Museum of the Accademia Etrusca in Cortona, which was a very important and prestigious academy of intellectuals, enlightened intellectuals here in Tuscany. And that's why I said that it was a recent adventure of my life. When I was there to visit the Accademia Etrusca in Cortona, and following the traces left by Mariti, I asked to have access to the old collection of coins, and found out one of those coins and the registration of the event when Giovanni Mariti went to Cortona and delivered to the academicians of the Etruscan Academy in Cortona the coins brought back by him from Larnaca. And so they are still there. One of them is still there from 1787, the date of donation, till now, is the earliest evidence of a collected objects came from Cyprus to Italy. And it was brought back by Mariti, who he was the positive, let's say, proto-archaeologist to use archaeological sources to reconstruct antiquities, but also the dark guy who was the first to initiate this exploitation and collecting of Cypriot antiquities to brought back to Western countries like Italy.
Of course, you also explore Sestini and Mondaini's work as well. Who are they, and how do their observations, how are they similar or perhaps even different from Mariti's?
Strictly related to Mariti. Mariti was the magnetic character of the three, let's say. Sestini was the cousin of Mariti. Domenico Sestini traveled to the east after Mariti, and he stopped back in Cyprus to observe and confirm what Mariti asked him to do, let's say, in some way. And Sestini was really an antiquarian, an expert in numismatics, and it was out of the three was the intellectual one, let's say. But his interest for Cyprus are completely driven by Mariti interest. But much more interesting is the role and character of Antonio Mondaini, who was from Livorno, from Tuscany as well, and he arrived to Cyprus well before Mariti, and also he was in the same community of Western European people in relation with Timothy Turner and so on. And for a long period when Mariti arrived to Cyprus, the two were best friends, let's say. They were together, they were exploring together, they common interest for many aspects of Cypriot living, like folklore, like a natural aspect, and antiquities as well. But at a point, Mariti tried to exploit Mondaini and his information and his data set of information, and that's why we can recognize different phases. In the first one, Mondaini gives freely everything he has, everything he collects in terms of information, of records to Mariti. And then at a point, we clearly see that Mondaini tried to set free from Mariti in some way, because Mariti was becoming famous. The books were having a very good feedback from the audience. They were translated in all the Europe and diffused everywhere. And Mondaini felt like he needed to find out his space. And Mariti like was really upset about, and there are letters between them where it is clear that Mariti really didn't want that Mondaini find out his way to exit from this relation. There's something psychological inside, and that's why at a point Mondaini decided to write down his accounts, his narrative on Cyprus, his travels to Cyprus, and all the records he collected using a pseudonym. And then the pseudonym is Namindiu, which is the reversal way of written Mondaini. And some years ago, Rita Severis published a manuscript by this mysterious Namindiu, and she was the first one who suggested that Namindiu was eventually Mondaini, and now we know for sure because it's in one of the letters that Mondaini sent to Mariti, he clearly stated up that he decided to use the pseudonym to write up all the books he wanted to publish then from then on. But unluckily, he was not able to do it. And what we have since now is the manuscript published by Rita Severo in 2007, and the letters we have. And all the other information are driven by Mariti in his books.
And if I'm not mistaken, one of their disagreements was around the location of Kition, right? Or what did they think? Like, one of them presumably thought that it was underneath Larnaca. What did the other think?
Yeah, there's a sort of polemic about the location of the ancient Kition, and in the end we have to reveal that the Mariti solution was the right one, because Mariti was convinced that Larnaca was the ancient Kition place, and actually it is, as demonstrated by the excavation of the Department of Antiquities of the École Française and so on. So it's clear that Mariti was right, while Mondaini suggested that it was Cape Chitti, Chitti in Italian, Kitty, let's say in Greek, that it was the ancient Kition. And Mariti was in the phase of conflicting with Mondaini, and there's a lot of letters of exchanging opinions about. And then Mariti decided to publish a small booklet, let's say a small book about the location of Kition, and it was really polemic against Mondaini, and he said, you can't understand, you are not, without mentioning him personally, but it's clear that he's addressing to him. The book itself is like a long letter addressed to a friend of him was living in France, which was Mondaini living there at the moment. And it's really polemic. Like you say that you decided that Kitty is the place to locate Kition because you like to stay there and enjoying the time with the deity of the island and the god of wine, like to polemize and to have fun of this man of Mondaini. So the location, the different locations is the arena of a polemic between them, and again Mondaini was the one defeated.
I want to circle back to your title again, and one of the most famous or rather infamous archaeologists, and I think many people today would question the word archaeology when we associate it with Luigi Palma di Cesnola. You know, probably one of the most famous antiquarians active in the 19th century. Is there a direct link between the work of Sestini, Mondaini, and Mariti to the later work of someone like Cesnola? And could you say that it paved the way for this exploitative practice that we see later on in the late 19th and early 20th centuries?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I think it's the same phenomenon, actually. What is changing is the dimension of the phenomenon, but the mechanism set up in the late 18th century, I think is the same as the one which is really clear established in the 19th century. By people like Luigi and Alessandro Palma di Cesnola and many others. Even because if you think about it, they were more or less the same people with the same activities. All of them were diplomats with interest in archaeology, with the power to move money and means and the power to exploit and be part of this system, of this chain we described before, like and being the central actors of this, because the collectors like Mondaini, like Mariti and Cesnola, the collectors were the central actors of the system, because they moved the local diggers, the local diggers supply them with antiquities, and they, like collectors, supply museum with antiquities, and so they are the central element of the chain, let's say, and And so I think there are many similarities. And I, as I told before, we can recognize a good transformation, revolutionary, let's say, intent in the different insight that Mariti gave to the archaeological evidence. But at the same time, it was the starting point. The people in the moment, because Consul Turner and every one of them has the same attitude and the same, let's say, behavior. They were the first starting points for a mechanism, a process, which was like increasing, potentially exponentially increasing during the following decades. And we arrived in the time of Luigi Palma di Cesnola, 1 century later, and this is clearly established. But again, it's not starting from nothing. It's triggered by these premises and the intentions and the activities. And this is something that we are not completely out today as well, if you think about, because collectors still exist. A collector still more or less consciously, more or less willingly, are in the center of the same chain of supplying and delivering.
So I'm going to ask you a question. And Luca, I feel like you already answered it, but I'm going to ask it again. Are these characters people to be celebrated or lamented?
I mean, they are double-faced. And we as scholars or passionate for Cyprus antiquities, as we all are, we have to be as much honest as we can and say that we have to celebrate the fact that they initiate the use of archaeological evidence as a source for history, and they put the archaeological objects on the same level as the ancient written sources, and this is fundamental. And so we have to celebrate, we have to say, okay, that's good, but we have to lament also that while they're doing this, they also beginning to use these antiquities as a private property, as something that belongs to them. And that's why they feel like normal to collect and to bring with them to other countries. And then also they felt like they were own properties at the point that they feel in the position of donate themselves the antiquities they collect to a museum like the Accademia Etrusca in the case of Mariti, or to a museum like the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in the case of Cesnola.
Was there something in your work that you found really surprising, something that stood out to you that you'd like to share to listeners about the stories that you investigated?
Yeah, a lot of things, but I have again to climb down to my personal feeling in this, because some of the descriptions, especially Mondaini descriptions, are like description of travels he made in Cyprus from one point to the other. So it's the chronicle of this travel from Larnaca to elsewhere, let's say. And one of these travels is on the route going to Episcopi. I'm working in Erimi in the area of Limassol since almost more than 15 years. And so reading an Italian of that time, that it was just moving in the same spaces I know very well, since I feel familiar, like I feel Erimi Episcopi Colossi like my house, because I spent a lot of time there. I have a lot of friends there. So, and the description and looking in and finding out in his words the same spaces, the same places and encounters is really fascinating. And the description, the lively description of people he encountered there is he describes, for example, a wedding in Episcopi, a wedding of two young couples, and the description is full of really funny anecdotes involving the priest, involving the friends involved. So it's really fresh as a description. And I was in a lot of wedding in that area. Okay. After it was like more than 2 centuries later. But I mean, I had the impression to have met the grandson of the people met by Mondaini, and so that's why I felt really deeply emotional.
You mentioned Rita Severus. She published, I think, back in 2007. And I mean, his work, his letters were published. Is there anywhere else where listeners, if they were interested in finding Mariti's work and Sestini's work, are they readily available to be purchased?
Okay, there's an important. Okay, Rita Severus made a masterpiece in the publication of the manuscripts, which is really fundamental reading for all the people interested in these three travelers, and of course there are some other important readings that can be made about the tree. For example, there's a new recently published book in Italian by Renato Pasta, which is an historian of the modern age, dedicated to the how can I say the books of Mariti and the way how have been translated and the fortune they have in the all the Western countries. So is interesting in this book to see the impact of what Mariti did in the developing of knowing about Cyprus and the Eastern Mediterranean, and of course in Cyprus there are other people interested, and they write a lot about this period, and they are much more expert than me, of course. And I can mention, for example, Iosifa Kyriakos, who was an important scholar who has published a lot about this Ottoman period in Cyprus, mentioning, of course, Mariti, Mondaini, and Sestini.
Luca, I want to thank you again so much for sharing this really cool part of Cypriot history, where I think most of us wouldn't really get a chance to know about these early figures in Cypriot archaeology. And your book is really fun to read. Again, it's called From Exploration to Exploitation, Giovanni Mariti, Domenico Sestini, Antonio Mondaini, and the Early History of Cypriot Archaeology. Luca, it was awesome.
Thank you, Andres. You are so kind, really.
Thanks, Luca. Take care.
Thank you. Take care. Ciao, Andres. Bye-bye.